We owe much to the ancient Greeks, from the invention of democracy, to citizens' participation in government, to the Olympic Games. The Greeks laid the foundations of science and created Western drama. In the 6th century BC, a reform was implemented in Athens that would radically change the lives of the Greeks. An estimated 80,000 Athenians witnessed a political revolution. The city-state was in crisis. The ordinary people had revolted against the king and the nobles. They wanted a say in all important decisions. It was the birth of the public assembly. Every citizen of Athens could participate, or almost everyone. Only men aged 18 and over were permitted. There was almost always a crowd. The poor received a daily payment for attending, so that they too could have their say.
Einer nach dem anderen! Wer bist du?
Agapetos! Agapetos!
In Ordnung, komm hoch.
The citizens of Athens met once a month in a square near the Acropolis to engage in politics.
Agapetos, mein Freund. Es wurde aber auch Zeit.
Ja, ich hatte noch zu tun.
This monthly People's Assembly was the first of its kind in the history of the world. Its introduction marked the beginning of a new system, democracy. The word democracy means rule of the people. But in Athenian democracy, the people meant adult male citizens. Women, children, slaves, and foreigners had no part in it. The wealthy nobles had the greatest political influence. The second and third classes, merchants, tradesmen, and wealthy farmers, provided the lower-ranking officials. The fourth class was made up of day laborers, but all classes could participate in the public assembly.
Within Greece, Sparta's rival, Athens, also small, vulnerable, a city of merchants, playwrights, and farmers. But faced with a powerful enemy, Athens must decide to accept Persia as its master or try and make common cause with its bitter rival. The decision will determine the future of the Western world and the story of all of us. The Age of Iron gives power to the people. The small city-state of Athens faces a choice: submit to the Persian Empire or fight for freedom. An envoy of the Persian Emperor Xerxes offers the people of Athens a chance to surrender and avoid bloodshed. The cost: their freedom. Male citizens of Athens gather on a rocky hill called the Pnyx. Among them, Sophones. Brave, outspoken, an ordinary citizen who will become a military legend. Citizens of Athens are armed with iron weapons. They have a duty to defend themselves and their city.
The ability to express yourself freely is so uniquely tied to the ability to defend yourself freely. The Athenians appreciate and value freedom, their ability to be self-expressed, their ability to have a say in their government, and they're willing to fight for that.
Political decisions in Athens are made not by kings, but by its armed citizens, men like Sophones. A new political system, a legacy still shaping civilization today. democracy.
It's not everyone. It's primarily male landholders who can vote. Women were not part of the process at this point. Nonetheless, it's a dramatic shift from having strong men and tyrants. You have the ability for self-determination.
A black stone. Surrender. A white stone. Fight.
Vote yes, and you've committed yourself to risking your life to fight. Vote no, and you'll be safe, but you'll be ruled by a stranger. Tough decision, but the point is it's being made by ordinary people. And that's what's astonishing about what the Greeks introduced to the history of humanity.
An Athenian records the will of the people.
Such is our love of liberty. We will never surrender.
The Parthenon. It takes 15 years to build. A temple to Athena, goddess of wisdom, will become a symbol of democracy.
It's the fairest way to organize a society that anyone in human history has ever conceived and realized. And we owe all of that indirectly to a small group, a handful of men who lived in a place called Athens 2,500 years ago.
The rulers of Rome did not think very highly of the Athenian model. Later, absolute European monarchs rejected any participation of the people in their government. In Germany and in France, the people had to fight for their rights for centuries. With the French Revolution, democracy finally returned to continental Europe. Women have had the right to vote since the early 20th century. The right of the people to participate in government is now a basic principle throughout the Western world. The Romans conquered and unified Europe. Their greatest achievements lay in administration, infrastructure, and above all, their system of law. At the peak of society were Rome's oldest families, the wealthy aristocracy. They held the top jobs in politics and the army. After them came the knights, successful merchants and rich men who had risen to the top in civil administration. Below them came the broad mass of plebeians, ordinary people, mainly craftsmen and farmers and their families. At the bottom were countless slaves, men and women living a life of drudgery so that the economy of the gigantic empire could prosper. Citizens of Rome had one enormous privilege. In the eyes of the law, they were all equal. While slaves were at the mercy of their masters, all Roman citizens, without exception, had the protection of Roman law. The Romans were a litigious people. Their courts were open to the public, and many citizens attended them as a pastime. Aspiring lawyers had to train long and hard. As there was no formal legal education, they learnt from experienced lawyers. Cicero was the most famous Roman orator of them all. Generations of lawyers modelled themselves on him, because only a brilliant speaker could win the day in court. A Roman trial proceeded much as trials do today. First, the plaintiff presented his case. It was then considered in the presence of the defendant. A jury delivered its verdict. They had cards with A for absolvo, acquittal, and C for condemno, conviction. The penalties ranged from simple fines to banishment to death in the arena. If the majority of the jury abstained, the verdict was in dubio pro reo. When in doubt, for the accused. Political crimes were prosecuted in extraordinary courts, which were also open to the public. But the law itself was the same for all citizens. Everyone had the same protection, rich and poor, men and women. Roman law was perhaps the empire's biggest export. No other set of laws has had such a strong influence on later legal systems. In Germany, every law student still has to study Roman law because it is the backbone of the legal systems of continental Europe. Nor is it only European courts that follow the tradition of Roman law. The Charter of the United Nations in New York is also based on Roman principles.
Stories from Parliament. Magna Carta. England, February 1215, and all is not well. Across the country, from north to south, the voices of angry barons can be heard. The cause of their anger? One man.
King John.
He demands even higher taxes to pay for his futile wars in France.
And if we do not pay up, he takes what he wants. We have to find a way to stop him raising taxes whenever he chooses.
And taking our land.
Oh, stealing our
He
land!
promised that all this would stop.
Oh, he always promises.
Well, his promises mean nothing. We must do something to make him keep his word.
We are the Baron Lords of England, yet he shows us no respect.
He can arrest us and hold us prisoner without a fair hearing.
Yeah, our widowed sisters and mothers can be forced into a marriage just because the king orders it.
Our rights and freedoms should be protected by law.
Oh, King John believes he is above the rule of law.
Then we must have new rules, which even a king must obey.
And it is not just the barons who believe it is time to act. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself intervenes.
He may be above the laws of men, but no one is above the laws of God.
Pray silence for Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury.
My lords, you have come here today from all corners of England. Tell me, what are your concerns? Robert Fitzwalter, Lord of Dunmow Castle, speak first.
My lords, when our king raises taxation yet again, he offends the people. When he seizes lands that do not belong to him, he offends the barons. And when he seizes the wealth of the church, he offends God.
Richard de Clare, Earl of Hertford, you wish to speak?
My Lord Fitzwalter is right, but what can we do? The king cannot be reasoned with. He's too powerful.
Then we must find a way to limit his powers.
And how will we do that? There are no rules which a king has to obey.
We will make new rules.
He won't listen to us. He refuses to recognize our rights. We have no voice.
Then we must declare our rights and find a voice. We must send a clear message to the king. He must agree to limit his power.
And if he does not agree?
Then together we will raise a great army. We will take London and leave him no choice.
But even when he knows that the barons are taking action, King John continues to raise taxes and seize lands which do not belong to him.
Your Majesty, the rebels advance towards London.
Really? Let them advance where they like. I have nothing to fear from Robert Fitzwalter and his rabble.
They gather support, Your Majesty. The closer they get to London, the stronger they become.
I told you, I have nothing to fear. The people of London will stand by their king.
I'm not so sure, Your Majesty. Fitzwalter calls his troops the army of God. I believe the people of London are on his side.
I don't care. I don't care whose side the people are on. I will not submit. No king of England will ever obey rules laid down by traitors.
A messenger from London, Your Majesty.
Approach, speak.
Your Majesty, Fitzwalter is in London.
And?
The people cheer him.
They cheer a rebel traitor who dares to stand against his king?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Perhaps, Your Majesty, it is time to talk to the rebels.
Never. I am the King of England. I do not talk to traitors.
But King John will talk. He has no choice, and on the 15th of June, 1215, at Runnymede near Windsor, the two sides meet. The barons present the king with a document. 63 rules have been written down on parchment. This will become one of the most important and famous documents in history. People will call it the Great Charter, Magna Carta.
Force widows to marry against their will.
Agreed.
You will not raise taxes without the agreement of the barons.
Agreed.
No free man can be imprisoned without being charged.
Agreed.
Every man has the right to a fair trial.
Agreed.
And 25 barons will watch you carefully to make sure that you obey these rules.
Agreed.
King John places his royal seal on the document so that the whole world will know that he has agreed to obey these new rules. Of course, this document doesn't put an end to the quarrels between kings and barons. Some of the rules are quickly changed, and many are broken or ignored. But on the 15th of June, 1215, something important has happened. Magna Carta has shown for the first time that it is possible to lay down rules which even a king must obey. Some of those rules apply to this day.
When the Pilgrims finally reached America, not only were they really late, but they were in the wrong place. They had landed far to the north of Virginia. This was a big deal because this was not where the land patent stated they were to settle, and it meant that winter would soon be upon them, and they were low on food and supplies. Before disembarking, the Pilgrims would sign the Mayflower Compact. The Pilgrims knew that some earlier settlements in the New World had failed due to the lack of government. The Mayflower Compact was a social contract in the form of a sacred covenant sworn before God, in which the settlers stated their purpose for coming and consented to follow the rules and regulations of the government for the sake of survival. The government, in return, would derive its power from the consent of the governed. The short little agreement is often referred to as the very foundation of the Constitution of the United States and a cornerstone of American government. Future U.S. President John Quincy Adams, who also had ancestors on the Mayflower, would later describe the Mayflower Compact as the only instance in human history of that positive, original social compact. a compact that many believed to be the only legitimate source of government. Some modern textbooks have stripped out the compact's sacred language in order to be politically correct. Find an unaltered copy and read it. While you're at it, read the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, but we'll learn more about those later in the series.
Let's hear it for Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford. Hip hip 1639, because it was on January 14th of that year that representatives of those three towns gathered to write what would be the first constitution in what would become the United States of America, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It seems old habits die hard. New habits, you may be thinking. Isn't this a novel, forward-looking approach that would eventually lead via the state constitutions to the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States of America, and this particularly American habit of relying upon social contracts among the people to create governments? Nope, I said old habits, and I meant old habits. The men and women who came to the British colonies in the New World, and most particularly who came to New England, were very proud of being free and understood freedom in a very specific sense, to mean that a compact among the citizens limited what government could do. Now, eventually they would come to understand this in significant measure through the analysis John Locke gives in his second treatise of government. But that was more than 50 years in the future when these delegates gathered and created the Fundamental Compact. Essentially, they did it because they were English, and the English had always done it that way. Now, you may be tempted to quibble that the first constitution in what would later become the United States was the Mayflower Compact. But I'm going to quibble right back at you. First of all, that was made on ship, not on the shore. But secondly, all it did was say they had the right to make laws. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut actually do make laws. They create political offices, and they specify how the voting was going to be done. And in creating this, they were, of course, you know where I'm going with this, right? They were looking back to Magna Carta, to this specific understanding. Government isn't a contract between the citizens and the state. It's a contract among citizens laying out the powers of the state and retaining the right to alter or abolish the state if it becomes destructive of those ends. It's based on fundamental liberty. Now, it's easy to look at government in the United States today and say that it seems to be almost as badly off the rails as government in Canada or in Britain, to say nothing of what it's like outside the Anglosphere. And you'd be right about that. All kinds of pressures and deformations have eroded the foundations, which we actually share with them in significant measure. But that doesn't change the fact that those foundations were fundamentally right. They were historically right, they were theoretically right, they were grounded in an understanding of the dignity of man that is missing in much of the world and seems to me is being lost around us today. So that's why I say 3 cheers for Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford. Hip hip 2016.
The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was the first constitution that clearly separated a dual system of government, where you had both proportionate representation by population and sovereign representation by units like towns, which would become states. The other reason it's called the Constitution State is because Roger Sherman broke the deadlock at the Constitutional Convention in dealing with adopting the model of the Constitution State, which had been recommended actually by Noah Webster when he was 29 years old and left his Sketches of American Policy with George Washington during the Constitutional Convention. So there's a legacy there, right from the Fundamental Orders right through to the Constitutional Convention. Now, it is true that by the time the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were actually established, they were no longer thinking they were extensions of England, whereas the Pilgrims, when they came, the Mayflower Compact was in 1620, and even though England did not even appreciate nor respect that document, there's no question the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were done in a freer concept, a freer intellectual concept of saying, let's deal with both the charter and the bylaws at the same time. whereas the Mayflower Compact preceded the Constitution of the Pilgrims by 16 years.
The Puritans were not the only persecuted religious group that fled to the New World. In England, devout Catholic Cecilius Calvert inherited his father's land grant in the northern Chesapeake. Cecilius sent his younger brother Leonard to serve as the expedition's leader and Maryland's first governor on 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, loaded with Catholic and Protestant immigrants. They called the founding site and first capital of Maryland St. Mary's City. By negotiating for a parcel of land and village site with the Yaocomanco Indians, the colonists were provided with immediate shelter, cultivated lands, and access to the Chesapeake Bay and trade routes. In exchange for axes, hoes, cloth, and hatchets, the settlers moved in, sharing the villages with the Yaocomanco for the first year. In this way, they were able to avoid the starving times experienced at Plymouth and Jamestown. 2 years before Roger Williams established Rhode Island, Maryland was a place where all Christians could practice their religion freely. Hence, Maryland soon had a variety of Protestants, including socially radical Quakers. And like Anne Hutchinson in Rhode Island, this spirit of toleration inspired a strong woman named Margaret Brent to take her place in history. Margaret and her sister Mary owned land in Maryland and operated a successful plantation called Sisters Freehold. Margaret represented herself, her family members, and even her neighbors in court.
With the death of the Mary monarch, the crown passed to yet another Stuart, James II. Like Charles, James II had no regard for Parliament. He thought it a nuisance and declared he would rule without it. For the English, it was an all too familiar story. Would England be forever ruled by an endless line of Stuart kings? An unhappy thought. So the Bishop of London and 6 laymen took it upon themselves to invite, secretly, the ruler of the Netherlands, William of Orange, to bring his army and protect the English people from their own king. William agreed to the plan, and when he landed with his troops, the English army deserted James and the deposed monarch fled to France. Not a single shot was fired, and England's second revolution came to be known as the Bloodless or Glorious Revolution. The grateful country offered William and his wife Mary the throne, but this time there were strings attached. This time Englishmen were going to be sure that whoever sat on the throne understood the limits on royal powers before they got the job. A document was drawn up to specify the terms by which England would be governed. It said in part that no laws were to be made or suspended unless Parliament approved. No taxes were to be levied without the consent of Parliament. Trials must have juries. It was lawful to keep arms, and that elections to Parliament must be free. To the joy of the kingdom, William and Mary consented to the terms of this document. John Locke might have called it a social contract, but the English people simply called it their Bill of Rights.
What an extraordinary century it was for England.
The 17th century English philosopher John Locke is to be remembered for his wise and brilliant contributions to 3 great issues that continue to concern us to this day: how we should educate our children, who should rule over us, and what we should do about people who have different religious ideas. Locke grew fascinated by was what to do with people who don't agree with your religious views. In breaking away from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII in the 16th century, English Protestantism had started a process of noisy questioning of religion that couldn't now easily be stopped. Because this was threatening to get out of hand, there were arguments that there should be total government control over religion and a hard crackdown on dissenters. But Locke became one of the foremost advocates of freedom of belief in his beautiful Essay Concerning Toleration, written in 1667. Here he advocated toleration on the basis of 3 points. Firstly, because earthly judges, the state in particular and human beings in general, cannot dependably evaluate the truth claims of competing religious standpoints. Secondly, even if they could, enforcing a single true religion would never work, because you can't be compelled into belief through violence. And thirdly, coercing religious uniformity leads to far more social disorder than allowing diversity. Locke argued that the ultimate aim of the state was just to preserve the quiet and comfortable living of men in society, but that it have nothing to do with the good of men's souls. Religion was a personal choice, and churches were voluntary organizations which could set their own rules and be left to it. It was thanks to Locke's influence that the idea of locking up people for their beliefs fell entirely out of favor. By the 18th century, other European nations looked with envy at England, a place where what you happened to believe was simply deemed irrelevant to your status or prospects. This was a truly remarkable achievement for one book by one man to have set in train. But Locke didn't stop there. In 1689 he published a second extraordinary book, The Two Treatises of Government. This tried to answer the question of who should rule the country and on what legitimate basis. One common yet increasingly fanciful notion at the time was that political authority derived directly from God. But a more recent explanation from Thomas Hobbes had asserted that the totalitarian power of kings was justified by their ability to keep order and prevent repetitions of the chaos that had reigned, Hobbes had insisted, in the time before powerful governments, and that he had called the state of nature. By painting the state of nature in the darkest colours, Hobbes had asked his readers to set themselves low expectations for what a decent ruler was meant to be. Anything better than the savagery of the Stone Age was legitimate, and rulers had no responsibility to guarantee religious freedom or human rights. But now, in the first treatise, Locke thoroughly demolished the scriptural claim that God had created kings, and in the second treatise he took on Hobbes's ideas about the state of nature. Locke agreed with Hobbes that before and without government there would have been a state of nature, but he disagreed what this place would actually have been like. He argued that it would have been broadly peaceful, and that in agreeing to submit to governments, people had therefore not fearfully agreed to surrender all their rights. In fact, they possessed a range of inalienable or natural rights that no ruler could ever take away. Locke insisted that people had voluntarily consented to cede some of their personal freedoms, but only insofar as it better preserved their rights. They couldn't be expected to give up these rights entirely, as that would just defeat the point of joining society in the first place. If a ruler started to act like a tyrant and unfairly deprive their subjects of their freedom or property, the subjects were then entirely within their rights to withdraw their consent, overthrow their ruler, and set up a new government. Locke's work hugely influenced the development of Western societies, and in particular the American Declaration of Independence. For example, in its insistence on the separation of church and state, and in the Second Amendment's right to bear arms, a clear descendant of Locke's view that a people should always retain both the right and the means to overthrow government.
In this episode of Our American Republic, we will discuss the political philosopher Montesquieu and the application of his theory on separation of powers to our constitutional republic. Montesquieu was the most cited philosopher in colonial America before the American Revolution, and he was referenced as a source by the Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike, accounting for more than a quarter of their citations during the constitutional debates. So, who was Montesquieu? Born in France on January 18, 1689, Montesquieu lived during the Age of Reason, also known as the Age of Enlightenment. Though his full name was Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede de Montesquieu, he is most often referred to only as Montesquieu. He was one of the principal thinkers at the heart of this great advancement in political and social thought. During the 18th century, Montesquieu made substantial contributions to the Enlightenment through his written philosophical works until his death on February 10, 1755. Published in 1748, Montesquieu's masterpiece was entitled The Spirit of the Laws. In this work, he built upon the writings of earlier liberal philosophers such as John Locke. He examined governments ranging from democratic to despotic and defined those that best set the limits to the use of arbitrary power. In The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu emphasized limited government powers through essential checks in order to protect the liberty of the people. Montesquieu states, "It has been eternally observed that any man who has power is led to abuse it. Power must check power by the arrangement of things." He continues, "In a state there are three sorts of powers. By the first, the legislative makes laws. By the second, the executive makes peace or war, sends embassies, establishes security, and prevents invasions. The last will be called the power of judging." In making his point about separation, Montesquieu writes, "When legislative power is united with executive power, there is no liberty, nor is there liberty when the power of judging is not separate from legislative power and from executive power." Montesquieu's philosophies on separation of powers are reflected in the structure of the government defined within our Constitution. The founders designed our new republic with not only a separate legislature and chief executive, but also with a separate judiciary, which is unique to Montesquieu's writing. Likewise, Montesquieu's concept of the executive veto on the legislature is also included within our Constitution. Montesquieu's works were well known and often quoted by the founders. The separation of powers, a key characteristic of American government, is often taken for granted in governmental discussions in the modern era. That said, how do Montesquieu's theories on government apply to us today? How well has the government maintained its essential checks and balances? What modern events highlight the need for separation of powers among the President, the Congress, and the judiciary?
Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract in 1762 in France, at a time of great change. The moral authority of kings and the church was being continually questioned, as was political power in general, and the world was becoming less feudal and increasingly global and commercial. Commenting on man's condition in this changing world, Rousseau starts The Social Contract with his famous lines, "Man is born free and is everywhere in chains." In a discourse on inequality, Rousseau had argued that in a state of nature, man has two innate impulses: self-preservation, what he calls amour de soi, which means love of self, and pity, or a repugnance towards seeing suffering in others. He argues that in the course of evolution, man starts to become civilized by comparing himself to others through what he calls perfectibility, essentially man's capacity for mimicry and development by copying others. As man enters society though, this amour de soi, the love of self, transforms into amour propre, which is a sense of his own self-worth. This stems from man learning from others but simultaneously comparing himself to them, which diminishes his pity for others. Modern society is defined by amour propre to the detriment of man, and so everywhere he is in chains, comparing himself to others. At the beginning of The Social Contract, Rousseau considers three ways of organising society that were part of 18th century orthodoxy: natural authority, right of the strongest, and slavery. Many at the time argued that rulers are like parents and the ruled like children, or that rulers are naturally better suited to ruling, or that if these aren't the case, maybe the strong should rule, just for the sake of stability. Rousseau makes a number of arguments against these that seem obvious to the modern mind, that children become independent from parents, or that even the strong can't rule with physical strength alone. He argues that all of these arguments have been made after the fact, that is, they have been made to justify the very state of affairs that they argue for, not the other way round. None of them fit the idea of man in a state of nature, with just a love of self and pity for others. So, he says that the only way a society can be formed is by a covenant, a pact, a social contract. He argues that even if people choose a leader, a social pact based on a prior agreement must have already been in place to begin the decision-making process. This is the basis of the social contract. So the question for Rousseau becomes how to find a form of association which will defend the person and goods of each member with the collective force of all, and under which each individual, while uniting himself with others, obeys no one but himself, and remains as free as before. This is the perennial question of political philosophy. In entering a political community, a state, you give up part of your freedom and submit to laws of the community. Anarchists argue that this is never justified. Is it possible to prove that it is? Rousseau's answer, he writes, is in the total alienation of each associate of himself and all his rights to the whole community. He goes on to say that, as every individual gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all, and precisely because they are the same for all, it's in no one's interest to make the conditions onerous for others. For Rousseau, no one gives up their freedom for other individuals, but for the idea of an equal community. The community then is an abstract idea that is part of the individual. It is a concept that the individual creates rationally for himself. Rousseau conceptualizes a historical contribution to philosophy and psychology. This metaphysical community, or society, is what Hegel describes as Geist and what Freud takes inspiration from for the superego. It is arguably an inherent part of our own psychology. For Rousseau, this social contract should be organised by his most famous concept, the general will. It is this concept of a metaphysical community directed by the general will that is sovereign, not a king or a parliament. In a small community, each individual will be motivated by his amour de soi and his pity for others. In a community of equals, none will be motivated by the corrosive effects of amour propre, his comparing himself to others. Rousseau is not talking about equality of property, but equality of citizenship and direct democracy, that you have property on the basis that is afforded to you by the community. The community protects your individual rights, not the other way round. To act morally then is to act in accordance with the general will of the community, rather than one's own particular individual will. For Rousseau, giving up the freedom of natural liberty leads to a greater civil liberty. Politics should be judged on this basis, and leads Rousseau to one of his most infamous phrases. If an individual does not act in accordance with the general will, which, remember, according to Rousseau, would be rational for them to do so, then they should be forced to be free. This general will is worked out by the simple debating and voting of an issue, but importantly, each person should be directly involved in the process, and so Rousseau advocates small states and direct democracy, where interest groups and factionalism would be banned.